have been in tech writing field from 1979. So can you take us back to when you first started? What did technical writing look like back then when you initially started?
Well, I was working on an assembly line, putting together analog and digital microwave radios with a screwdriver and a soldering gun, and at firm, which was just taken over by Aeros Corporation. So the director of technical writing, Harry Tudor, came through the assembly area and said, "Hey, you have a PhD. I don't think you'd be too happy here doing this, but we'll take you into our technical writing department as a junior technical writer." Yeah, I was the kid. And in that configuration in those days, we had like 4 technical writers at desks under a raging air conditioner. Most unpleasant. I remember it. Larry was the head. We had a senior man, and then we had a super technical writer, Jules Willis. There was Bob, and there was the character from, I won't go over all the details. But he took me in to the department, and I got my own desk. And what I did was take care of the library. And that was all arranged according to BSP. That is a leitmotif that fits into the narrative because I learned BSP, Bell System Standard Practice, modes of organizing documentation. This was pre-divestiture, when everything was more Bell. And even after that, the first spin-offs from Ma Bell were organized that same pattern. So I took care of the library and organized the documentation. And we worked on typewriters, a printer, and we had a graphics person in-house that did all the drawings. And I did that, but luckily in those days, I had a development where everyone at Fair was sent out to local junior colleges, community colleges. And I took classes in AC/DC electronics, basic electronics, Ohm's law, series, parallel.
Okay.
They were teaching me that at night while I was doing field modification kits. That was kind of jobs that the kid did. What for installing old variants on the microwave radio. But the reason I got in there was because earlier I had worked for the Navy in a mil-spec environment as a precision solderer, making my antennas for F-15s, radar evading. So I already knew the basics of microwave theory when I came back and got this job.
Yeah.
And then they turned me out like a journeyman technical writer. And after so many years, Paris went bust and they laid off everyone. And there I was with a strange inheritance that I got from an odd relative in Montana. You might call my stuff just in the nick of time, because just as I was getting laid off and I was going crazy, and that kind of, I'd never experienced that energy that you would go. And one day the phone rang and a corporation was coming into existence. And I went down San Jose to interview, just in the nick of time again. And I walked in the door and they had fired the previous techno writer for embezzling funds using a kickback scheme with the printers. I walked in the door, I turned a corner and I looked down the hall. There was my mother's old boss where she worked. He was Mr. William Buckley, who was the vice president of market forecasting, and also sat on the C1 meeting of ANSI. So he said, "Oh, Bruce, I know you, and how'd you like to be senior tech writer here?" And I said, "Well, sure. Would you like 5,000 shares of founder stock?" I said, "Well, that's not odd." Looking at my bank account, about $200 to my name, and they gave me my own office. And because I had a work ethic, I came in there and just flowered. I could do everything. And I said, "Oh, boy, that guy's good, you know?" And that was in the early days of Synchronous. In 83, the FCC had ruled that customer premise equipment was now the responsibility of the end user. And customer prem That means routers, bridges, multiplexers, DSU. What became the Cisco environment, the edge. And that happened to be just when the internet was taking off. And all you had at that time was T1, which was 1.554 megabits per second. That was fast then. And they could double it today in some kind of a jujitsu. But it happened that they had the contract with T1 service. And every link that people were putting in had to have a Verilink CSU DSU. And so a sweetheart deal, and the regulatory agencies made it compulsory that people had to buy these.
Okay.
So we were making them for $300 manufacturing cost, ROI, return on investment, and we were selling them for $3,300. So Verilink made $60 million in months, and the place exploded. And that was the early days of the internet when it was wild and woolly. There were so many startups popping up in the Silicon Valley, and we were known. So we had our own table at the fish market in Palo Alto. So you flash the Rolex and you go there, and our marketing department would go in like we were, a joint chiefs of staff. Interesting things there. But they made mistakes that I learned from, because their president, Lee Belden, in his wisdom, took all of our R&D money, spent it on a company that sold him a product that didn't work. And so they lost their forward offensive operations. They had a guy, Stephen C. Taylor, who was their their engineering genius. And when they didn't have money to pay him, and he had a house in Hillsborough with his own lab, he said, "Where's the money?" And they said, "We don't have any more." So they tried to invent themselves, but they didn't have the money they did before.
Right.
So they fired the director of marketing, and he went over to Tektronix. And one day when things were getting really slow, he called me on the phone and he said, "How would you like to work for Tektronix?" And I said, "Well, it's kind of slow here, and you can feel the tension, So I said, "Okay," and went across the street to Mountain View to LPCOM Tektronix. And they were in network test and diagnostics and protocol analysis between the DTE and the DCE. Again, at the end where I had been. At that time, I came in for more money, and it just so happened we were doing protocol analysis of all of the leading protocols used in LANs and in the CO, central offices.
Okay.
And it also so happened that we had the first software analytical tools for testing TCP/IP protocol, the protocol of the net. But at that time, it was just a little thing. But I learned the basics of protocol analysis from the ground up, which set me in a very good position.
Right.
I positioned myself in the Valley just at the time that was opening up. And I knew the hard technical nuts and bolts of protocols.
Right.
And you see how my education proceeded from microwave to layer zero,
Right.
soldering, interface. It was like an education,
Right.
But I count everything, my career from then on, being based on the fact that I learned protocol analysis of the dominant protocol that became the internet, and eventually traveled through Ethernet, and it spread out across the world faster and faster.
True.